From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome. Today's event is sponsored by Science and Technology and Business Division. I'm Tomoko Steen. I'm research specialist here at the Library of Congress. And we have technical reports under our division on Japanese World War II biological weapons collections, which is original documents, and also Japanese section of the Asian division have Japanese reports in language Japanese of the same group, Unit 731. So if you are interested, please contact me after the talk, and I'm happy to actually, show you where the things are. Today's speaker, Professor Jeanne Guillemin, she's a senior advisor to Security Studies program at MIT. Her undergraduate is from Harvard in psychology, is it? And also PhD in anthropology and sociology from Brandeis University. And she served in advisory committee to the Folklife Center, and I was surprised to know that she had a connection to Library of Congress. And she is also taught at Boston University before the current position. Jeanne is also a member of the World Economic Forum, Global Agenda Council in Weapons of Mass Destruction, WMD. And so she's preparing for the report for next meeting. And also I have to mention that we are joined by distinguished guest, Professor Matthew Messelson from Harvard. Professor Messelson is advisor to several presidents on the bioweapons issues, and also husband of Jeanne. So before further ado, please join me to welcome Professor Guillemin.
Well, good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here at a wonderful institution. And I offer my special thanks to Tomoko Steen for arranging this event. What I'm going to do is begin, just to give you the framework, with a brief history of why we care about anthrax, just very quickly. And then I'm going to go into the anthrax letter attacks, by the way, which are always within the framework of 9/11. If that's not clear, I hope to make that clear. And then emphasize as I go through this, as I've done in my book, what the American response has been, what the American response was, and in some ways what the American response continues to be. And it's a very American story. It's really our story, even though the repercussions of the anthrax letters were felt really around the world. Here's Fort Detrick, Maryland, 1958. I present this image to you because we'll see later how much Fort Detrick has changed. But back in 1958, it was the center for the United States offensive biological weapons program, which means that and it was very covert. It was not something that was being advertised. It's not something that people knew about the way they knew about nuclear weapons. And it was very much here. And 1958 was a crucial year for the program because it's in 1958 when the science level appreciably increases in terms of expertise about, for example, dose response if you want to disperse anthrax, about the making of bombs for, again, dispersing anthrax. And we must always remember this is all anti-civilian. The biological weapons program was to be a kind of complement to the nuclear weapons program. This is within the Cold War and within the larger strategy of total war, which meant that civilians were fair game. So the weapons being developed here were to be targeted, in theory, were targeted against the Soviet Union, particularly against the Soviet Union and its major cities. Well, in 1969, we have the Nixon Decision. This is a groundbreaking decision, extremely important in the history of biological weapons. and also in the history of the military, because it's the first time in United States history when an entire class of weapons was just taken off the table. That is, Nixon renounced biological weapons in 1969, saying that the United States would have no more to do with offensive development of biology, the use of the biological sciences in order to create these awful germ weapons. And I really should mention here that Matthew Meselson was very important in the decision that Nixon made. He worked to create the position papers. He worked to define the policy issues. And although it was very much behind the scenes, this was really a major accomplishment. Why was it a major accomplishment? Because 1969 is also just at the time when the great advances in genetics are coming on stream. And the United States, thank goodness, pulled out of the business of exploiting the biological sciences for hostile use just at this crucial time. Now, just going very quickly, in 1972, the United States, along with the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom, became the three architects for the Biological Weapons Convention. Now, in 1925, the Geneva Protocol forbade the use of biological and also chemical weapons. But in 1972, the Biological Weapons Convention forbids the programmatic development, production, research on biological weapons. So it's an anti-program piece of legislation, and it mandates transparency. But was there transparency? Well, there was no enforcement that was really given to the treaty, and there were rumors after the treaty was signed that the Soviet Union had in fact violated the terms of the treaty. That is, that behind the scenes, illegally, they had been doing work on biological weapons, and particularly on the development of anthrax. So in late 1979, early 1980, there comes a rumor that there's been a very large anthrax outbreak in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, known to be a closed city, a military city with a military base. And if you look at this particular map, you'll see right up here, if I can, here we go, right. Okay, not sure if I'm getting the whole drift of it. Yeah, here we go, right here. If you were to be in this particular area, this is called Compound 19, and right in this particular area, there was in 1979 a facility for experimenting with and producing anthrax, that is anthrax spores, for delivery as weapons. So at this particular time, in 1979, 1980, no one knew what was really going on. There were a lot of suspicions, and the Soviet Union wasn't telling anybody what was going on. However, with the fall of the Soviet Union, it was possible to go to Russia, and it was possible to go into the city of Sverdlovsk, now called Ekaterinburg. And I was part of the team that went, and Professor Meselson, I have to say again, he led the team, he organized everything, he got us over there. And what I was able to do with door-to-door interviews with the families of the people who had died, 66 people, as we officially record at that time, was to determine where they were during the workday. Now, we had information about where these people lived, but we didn't have information about where they were during the day, so the daytime location was very important. So if you look at the daytime location, what you get is a non-random pattern. Now, we also know from autopsies that were done on 41 of the victims of this particular outbreak that the cause was inhalational anthrax. So that clinical evidence was there. And I should mention that in our audience today is Dr. Lev Grinberg, one of the pathologists who brought us that information. And we're very pleased to have him. He's come all the way from Ekaterinburg to visit Washington, and very, very pleased, and we welcome you. So this just extends the work of the Meselson team going out into the countryside. Now, why is this important? This is important because our information now is coming out in 1992, 93, 94, and it's after the end of the Cold War, but it is also just in the time of the the first Gulf War. It's just in the time when we're beginning to think more about terrorism. We have a terrorism framework that is beginning to become more important. In 1995, we have the Shinrikyo sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway, and simultaneously we have the Oklahoma City bombing, also in 1995. So this particular map, if you see how it plays out, shows how animals died in the aftermath of the release from compound 19, what we presume to be the release of spores from compound 19. So what it's also telling us is that anthrax can be lethal at a particular distance. In this case, it's about 30 kilometers or 50 miles. Well, in all of the work that the United States and other countries had done on anthrax, they had never reached that conclusion. They didn't know that, in fact, it could be lethal over a long distance, given appropriate atmospheric conditions and the right kind of material. So this was news, and it was news that became very important as we looked at potential bioterrorism scenarios in the late 1990s. Now, we have Iraq as a threat. We're still worried about leftovers of the Soviet Union, and there became a very strong interest from President Clinton and then on down in the possibilities of anthrax attacks on the United States. And so here we have the then Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, in a speech that became very famous. It's called the sugar bag speech, in which he points out that this amount of anthrax, if it were released from a small, low-flying plane over Washington, would kill a lot of people. And that really rang home. I mean, and it was also on national television, so the threat aspect really came home. It also changed an institution, which the U.S. Army Research Institute for Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick, which was retained and kept purely for defensive reasons after the Nixon decision. The rest of Fort Detrick, the offensive part was closed down, but the defensive work of very good scientists looking particularly at anthrax was very important. If you go back from 1969-70 and then right up to when we're talking here, 1997. So this becomes a policy issue. That is, you have to vaccinate soldiers and you have to protect the country from anthrax. And these become two things, and Secretary Cohen, President Clinton, many people in Washington became very, very concerned about the anthrax threat. So that's our context, and you want to keep that as an important context. Well, if you go to post 9/11, a week after 9/11, you'll see, as according to this timeline, that there is a criminal act, and the criminal act is the posting of letters with virulent anthrax spores in them from a mailbox at Princeton, right on Nassau Street in Princeton. And again, I cannot emphasize enough how closely tied the anthrax letters are to 9/11, in the sense that they become associated with foreign terrorism, but also in the two cities where the greatest impact was felt: New York City, Washington. And you can see it. It's the World Trade Center, it's the Pentagon. And what you're going to see played out here, of course, with the anthrax letters, it's targeting mostly New York. We call them the media letters, but they're all were New York organizations. I say that with parentheses in a way, because the first victim was in Florida, but the company that owns American media still is New York based. So we're really looking at New York attacks and then attacks on Washington. So what's important about this? Well, we have the first diagnosis in Florida. That's on October 4th. I think everyone can stop for a minute and say, well, where was I in October of 2001? Because this was the big news. This is the news that took over the airways. The first diagnosis of inhalational anthrax was quite a shock, even though the administration kept very vague about how it had been caused, and they had to keep vague. They knew very early on that it was probably from a letter, but they didn't have the letter. The letter had been thrown out. So on October 5th, very, very quickly, we have two independent sources that verify that the strain of anthrax that's in the letter is called Ames. And that becomes extremely important. And I'll show you a slide a little bit later about why it becomes important. But it's amazing now when you look back on it how quickly that work was done. The basis for good science was already in place in 2001. And as we're going to see, the science just gets better. Well, October 6, 8, we have the Daschle letters are being mailed. October 12th, we have a New York belatedly realizes that it has been the recipient of anthrax letters. So it's the Tom Brokaw letter. The revelation on October 12th that one of his assistants has developed cutaneous anthrax. It just wasn't recognized as that, but then belatedly it was. This causes a great furor. Again, panic, I think, would be a good word for it, but certainly pervasive fear, in the sense that people become nervous about their mail, that they become nervous about every white powder that they see, that they call 911. If they see spilled talcum powder or sugar from donuts, they call 911. And this was going on down in Florida, of course, and it was also going on in New York City. And don't forget New Jersey, because New Jersey, again, part of the larger epicenter. October 15th, the Daschle letter is opened, and this is the height of the calamity. And those of you who are from Washington, if you remember that particular episode, you'll know that the fear that had been generated by the attack on the Pentagon resonates again with the opening of the Daschle letter, so that people are, for example, being evacuated from buildings. Congress shuts down the following Wednesday, and it's a very nerve-wracking time. And also, in the opening of the letter, and I should emphasize this, in the opening of that letter, the exposure of people in the building was really underestimated. There really were many people in the immediate vicinity who were affected, who were inhaling, but it turned out that the spores were throughout the building as well. Also down at the American Media Building down in Florida, where the other letter had been opened, there were at least 600 people, probably more, who were probably exposed. So when we talk about, who were the victims, I think we also have to realize that we don't know all the victims. We don't know everyone who was exposed. But it wasn't just the 5 people who eventually died, and it wasn't the 17 others who became ill, that there was a larger population that was exposed. So I'm going to do timeline with you again, just to, talk out of the timeline. On October 16th, we have a lot of activity going on up at Fort Detrick, and particularly at the U.S. Army Research Institute, what we call USAMRIID. Now, USAMRIID got the Daschle letter to analyze right away, because they had a special center there that could do very good analyses, and it was important that spore powder in the Daschle letter really get looked at very closely, that its characteristics be known. And there was a center there at USAMRIID that could do that. So the Daschle letter went right directly up to USAMRIID. And USAMRIID consequently became the center for something called Operation Noble Eagle, which is a very general mandate. It wasn't the only center involved in this way. But after 9/11, President Bush made it possible for military entities to engage in what you might look at as domestic protection activities. So USAMRIID and this particular entity inside of it became part of Operation Noble Eagle. And what did that mean? That meant that all of the samples that were being turned in, whether they were from Florida or from New York or wherever they were coming in, and certainly from Washington, D.C., that they would go to Fort Detrick and they would be analyzed there. Now, that very small center had to expand very quickly. It had to bring in dozens of other scientists. It only had a small group of 7 people or so who could do the work. So they brought in dozens more from other institutes in order to help analyzing all these samples. And over the course of almost 3 months, they analyzed 30,000 powder samples. Can you imagine what that means? Well, I think nearly all of them were nothing. I mean, they weren't anything, but some were, and some were crucial to understand and important to understand. It's also true that the Centers for Disease Control is involved round the clock at this point, doing the same kinds of analyses, particularly on the clinical cases, because now we're getting more reports of the cutaneous, we're getting more reports beginning to come in about potential inhalational cases. So there's a lot of government response here, which is at a very high level, a really frenetic level, and everybody's description of USAMRIID at this particular time is that it was really chaotic. It was a very difficult time, and again, CDC as well. So October 18th, very crucial, a postal worker is diagnosed on October 18th with having cutaneous anthrax. Now, this is not a woman working in the major facility, Hamilton facility in New Jersey, where we find out through postal codes, the anthrax letters were processed. This is a woman who was a mail deliverer who would get mail out of, from that facility and just go around dispersing it in the Trenton area. This is down in the southern part of the state. So Hamilton, New Jersey, the news comes back, this woman has cutaneous anthrax. Now, you just don't come down with cutaneous anthrax in the vicinity of Hamilton, New Jersey, without setting off a kind of alarm about, did she get it from the mail and what is going on inside that facility? Now, what's interesting here is that the workers inside the Hamilton facility were already very nervous about what was going on in terms of a letter that was dangerous, because they knew what most of the rest of us didn't know, is that to process a letter, it goes through a digital barcode sorter, which actually compresses it, spins it around a spindle, compresses it, and shoots it forward while it's doing all the printing. And they were nervous about what that processing meant if you had a letter with powder in it. And they didn't have the answer to what that meant, but they were very nervous about it. And also down in Washington, D.C., at what we call the Brentwood Postal Facility, they were very nervous too, because they had at least the Daschle letter, and then as great suspicion, by the way, that there was more than one letter. They were getting reports of contamination in the Hart building, of course, where the Daschle letter had been opened, but the contamination was leading back to the postal room of the Hart building, indicating that this thing had been leaking, that this letter had been leaking, and that information came in very early. So you have two different groups, one in Hamilton, and you've got another group down in Brentwood, and they're very nervous about these letters. Now, I have to pause here and say that we have two wonderful people from Brentwood Exposed, Dina Briscoe and Helen Lewis, and they're sitting right over there. And these are two of the three people, Terrell Worrell is the third person, who invented Brentwood Exposed. And that's in February of 2001. And their grassroots response was, I think, the best of American civilization and culture. That citizens are concerned, let's get together, let's talk about it, let's have some action points, and let's go forward. And that's exactly what the Brentwood postal workers did. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about civic response. But anyway, here we are. October 19th, the Hamilton facility is shut down. Why is the Hamilton facility shut down? It's shut down not because the postal officials wanted it shut down. They didn't. And not because the Centers for Disease Control wanted it shut down, because they were there too, looking things over. Neither of them felt that the shutdown of Hamilton was very important. However, the public health people who were in charge, particularly George DiFerdinando, had a lot of training in occupational health, and he cared about worker safety. He said, this is a worker safety issue. If the building is shut down and you're going to go in there and you're going to find out that, test for anthrax, you keep it closed until you really know the results of those tests. Because the CDC and the Postal Service people wanted it, go in, take some swabs, look at the dust, send it off somewhere, get it looked at, but open it up within 12 to 24 hours because the mail has to keep going. Well, George D. Ferdinando stood up to the powers that be and said no. He said, if you open it up, I will not stand with you on the podium. I will not be there when you go on television and the media to tell people that I really approve of the reopening of Hamilton. So they said, okay, George, it's shut. And a good thing, because it was fully contaminated. It was loaded with anthrax spores. And in fact, one of the people who did the environmental testing said to me later, we reached a point where we just stopped doing tests on the walls, the floors, and the machines because we just kept getting positives, and then we just decided to stop testing. It was very, very full. So what had happened, of course, is that the letters that went through, and I think we can particularly emphasize the letters to Senator Daschle and then to Senator Leahy, that those letters really did really did spew the spores out, that they really did throw the spores out. And of course, there are, for every gram of anthrax, you've got a trillion spores, something like that, if it's pure. And the Daschle and Leahy letter powder was particularly fine without really much debris. So here we are. It's October 21st, and October 21st is an important day because it's the day that the CDC hands in to the people at the Brentwood facility, who the manager particularly, but also to the CDC in Washington, the news that one of the Brentwood workers, in fact, has tested positive for inhalational anthrax, and that was Leroy Richmond. Now, Leroy Richmond did a wonderful job of insisting to his healthcare providers the previous Friday that he was sick, really sick. They were going to send him home with Cipro, or not even Cipro. I think it was Tylenol. Yes, it was Tylenol. We know this, right? You're sick, but go home with Tylenol. And fortunately, he persisted. He said, no, this is not the flu. Something's really wrong with me. So they did the tests. They had actually enough clinical evidence, but they waited for CDC, and then they waited for October 21st when the actual cultures came back, and CDC said, yes, this is inhalational anthrax. What's mystifying in all this, by the way, is why antibiotics were not distributed earlier to the postal workers. By the way, I have to mention here that thanks to a wonderful public health leader down in Florida, antibiotics were distributed to postal workers down in Florida. Isn't that interesting? But when the first patient died, Jeanne Guillemin down in Florida said those postal workers are in jeopardy. We've got to do something. So she went into the local post office where they knew there was contamination from a letter that had come in, and she made sure that they learned about anthrax, that they understood, that they got nasal swabs if they wanted them, and that they had access to antibiotics. But that information never made it up to New York, never made it up to New Jersey, and certainly never made it to Brentwood. So what we have on October 21st is the closure of Brentwood, finally. Now, a detail emerges later that I'll put in here. About a month or so after the closure of the Brentwood facility, experts from the Centers for Disease Control and also people from Canada, from the Canadian Army, who were experts on anthrax dispersal, went into Brentwood. It's all shut down. They went to the digital barcode sorter, number 17, where the Leahy and the Daschle letters had been processed. They had gone through. And what they wanted to do was test the air. Well, why test the air if the machine's not on? So they turned the machine on. They flipped the machine on. By the way, they're all in hazmat suits. They flipped the machine on. And then they test the air around. And what they found out was that spores were still circulating, that anthrax spores were still circulating around this machine. What does that mean? It means from the time the Daschle and Leahy letters were processed, which was October 11th, because it's all in the barcode, from October 11th until October 21st, people were walking through clouds of anthrax. Well, it never should have happened, and let's hope that something like that never happens again. But it is interesting how the information came in late. October 22nd, the October 21st is the date of the first death. The October 22nd is the date of the second postal death. Antibiotic distribution and then case surveillance begins. Well, we have more cases to come. October 25th, this is giving you like the sort of the flashpoints of this. A State Department contracted worker comes down. He's also misdiagnosed, by the way. He goes into a physician who tells him he probably has the flu. And even though this has all been on front page, it was very hard still for clinicians at the local level to read the symptoms and to make connections. A mailroom worker comes in, he's feeling awful, flu-like symptoms. It should have raised an alarm, but in this particular case, it really didn't. And so the man in question was sent home, but then he became more ill, and then they actually did do a test. It showed that he was infected, and luckily he survived. November 8th, this is another flashpoint day. Now we're bringing more of the FBI in here. What is the FBI doing, by the way, in all of this time? Well, they have been so focused on 9/11 that this blindsided them, this whole issue of anthrax letters. They'd never thought about them as serious. They had so many anthrax hoaxes. After the famous sugar bag speech and after so other incidences involving potential bioterrorism, anthrax hoax letters were normal in terms of what the FBI had to encounter. They were always getting calls from local police. So, yet another anthrax hoax. They'd never seen real anthrax letters. So they're very blindsided, and the first reaction that they have is, let's get the profile out. Let's try to figure out who would do this. So they did study the letters. They had recovered the 4 letters, 3 of the letters actually, because the Leahy letter isn't discovered until November 14. But they have 3 letters to look at. The material has been Xeroxed. The letters are pre-franked. There's no DNA here. There's nothing they can get a hold of. There's no fiber. There's nothing. They bring it to their experts in Quantico and in what was then the Washington lab, and they look over these letters and they're trying to figure out what could it be. So all they can really go by is the nature of the printing, and also how rational it was. I mean, the printing of the envelopes and then the printing of the letters, it's very crafty. I mean, there's something about it which says this person really planned it out. And it planned it out to look like Al-Qaeda, because the texts of the letters say, death to Israel, death to the United States, praise to Allah, things like that, and done in sort of a crude way with a misspelling of penicillin and things like that. So their profile people come up with the lone scientist profile. Now, why did they do that? In one way, they did it because of the Unabomber. If anybody remembers the Unabomber was their other big case of someone who perpetrated terrorism, but did it in a way that was rational, had a sort of scientific base to it, and also came from multiple sources, was mailed, out to different targets, and so they did go back to the Unabomber case, and they figured maybe we have somebody like that. So, and they also offered a big reward, and they tried to advertise around. When you look back on it now, it was a very primitive effort, to garner attention. They brought in the man from America's Most Wanted, and they tried to get the public involved. Well, the public did get involved, but it was a little bit like the hoax letters. They got so much, information back, and so many clues, and everybody suspected everybody. Like if you didn't like your neighbor, this, looks, he looks weird. He looks like a lone scientist to me, and so it wasn't a very effective way of doing things. November 14th, the Leahy letter, and then November 21. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the. October 31st, the death of the hospital worker in New York City. Very mysterious. No one has ever figured out whether this woman opened a letter, touched a letter, or what. We really don't know, but we do know that she died of inhalational anthrax. And because the surveillance for anthrax cases had gotten so good in New York, her case was not missed. Her case was very, relative to her appearing ill, her case was relatively quickly diagnosed. She did not survive. Another random case in November 21st, elderly woman up in Connecticut. Again, what is going on here? But with her, it's less of a mystery because one of her neighbors did have anthrax in his mailbox, and the local postal facility up in Connecticut was also tested positive for anthrax. So the theory is that some cross-contamination occurred from the Dashiell and Leahy letters, and that even a small trace amount of anthrax spores was enough actually to infect this 92-year-old woman. So let me go to civil actions here. What did we do? Well, the FBI wasn't solving the case. Let's just put it that way. It went on and on. They seemed to go off a track for some person. They broke down some doors over here, and they didn't really get any good leads. The leads just didn't seem to be coming in. It was a really difficult case, and it wasn't because they weren't putting money into it, and it wasn't because they weren't investigating, for example, alternative and even Al-Qaeda sources. So, for example, in 2004, the FBI got involved in doing tests at a site in Kandahar, where initially the results looked as if they had maybe some positive anthrax bacteria, something going on with them. But then when they did more intensive and more comprehensive tests, they came up with negatives. So they're trying this and they're trying that, and they're also trying to move along with creating a repository of Ames strains. That is the Ames strain repository, where if you just went out and found every laboratory possible that had a sample that was in the Ames strain category, could you get that all into a repository? Could you get people to give you samples in a standard form, and then could you test them against what was in the anthrax letters? Could you find a match of some sort? And very early on, and this was thanks to Rita Colwell, who was then the head of the National Science Foundation, it was her suggestion, let's get the DNA. Can we get the DNA evidence out of this? Can we do comparative DNA work? So that began very early on in 2001, 2002, but the technology wasn't up for it, and they had to get together the repository of all these different strains and samples, and so that didn't move too quickly. But what did move was civil action. So I mentioned the 2002 creation of Brentwood Exposed, very early on, very dynamic, a real reuniting of the Brentwood community, which had been dispersed to 6 other facilities. You know, when that facility shut down, people had to go someplace else. And they had been a community. They had been workers who knew each other. They had been workers who were family relations. There are postal families of people who go from generation to generation, or cousins and aunts and uncles and mothers and fathers. They work for the post office. And in this particular case, the community was very dispersed, and they also didn't know what had happened to them. They didn't know, were they infected, were they not infected, how long should they take those antibiotics. The antibiotics were making people ill. They were having a very, very rough time, and nobody in particular was paying attention to them. So they solved their own problem. They came together as a community of healing and of education. Now, another wonderful response is the case of the widow of the first victim, Bob Stevens, down in Florida, who came up with an idea with her very clever lawyer to phrase the problem of her husband's death as one of tort law. That is, somebody did something wrong in the civil arena by not protecting the public against a dangerous thing that it owned. Now, if you think of somebody who owns a bad dog, right? Okay, you're in that realm. Another case that came out of this kind of tort law was somebody who had a monkey who escaped in a hurricane, it's true, and was sued because the people were afraid of the monkey was going to bite them. It was a chimp. And so but the big case that the Stevens case relied on, the precedent, was had to do with a man who was drilling in the earth with an electric driller, and he hit a live line that a Florida power company had not advertised as dangerous. So they didn't advertise it was dangerous, and so the family of that man sued, and sued successfully. So Maureen Stevens' lawyer says, well, where did this stuff come from? Where did the AIM strain come from? And the answer is, and the consensus was very high, it came from usamrid. That is, if you wanted to trace, what was the source, the first source, you would go to the medical institute, because they had been using it for years to do their testing of vaccines and antibiotics. So, the lawyer says, the U.S. Army has failed, no matter who sent the letters, the U.S. Army has failed to contain the threat, the danger that it has posed by that anthrax material. Therefore, we will sue. And when she brought this suit originally, her complaint, people said, you sue the federal government, it never goes anywhere. But it did. It went up, it was cleared to go to trial at the federal level in Florida. And I think to the disappointment of some people, the widow finally settled last December. But all those years, that case went through the courts, and it really, even though it was settled, even though it wasn't brought to trial, it has established a kind of precedent for dangerous material owned by the government, who's responsible when the dangerous material gets out. And that's a very important thing, I think, that the family did. Multiple lawsuits by Stephen Hatfill. He was accused in the press, really, and by certain individuals of being the prime suspect for the anthrax letter attacks. The FBI never made him a prime suspect, but he did suffer a lot in the media, and he held them responsible. He held the Department of Justice responsible. And one of the things that he did, of course, was he got a very large multi-million-dollar settlement from the Department of Justice. Took years to do it. And he also, because he sued the New York Times and Vanity Fair, he also changed the libel laws that now pertain when a newspaper comes out and they want to say something negative. They have to look at Hatfill's cases and say, well, can we get away with this? Because he didn't consider himself a public figure, and he did not consider himself a person who was in any way guilty. He was innocent, but he was being represented very strongly in editorials as a guilty party. So those lawsuits were very important. And then just finally on the civil actions, how does America respond? One of the results of the anthrax letters was a large increase in what we call biodefense. That is the U.S. government investment in basic science research on anthrax, tularemia, plague, botulinal toxins, Ebola virus. You can go down the list. Unusual diseases that have been used in weapons programs or theoretically and considered as good agents in some sort of biological weapons conflict. So we developed, right after the anthrax letters, a great expansion of biodefense, so that it went from maybe $900 million, if you just look at the research and development aspect of it, up to about $5 billion in the course of 1-2 years. So in order to have this research done, there was a great expansion of what we call level 3 laboratories, the ones where you have to gown up and where the select agent being studied is dangerous, but for which there are cures. It also resulted in the increase in what we call BSL-3, biosafety level 4 laboratories. And those laboratories are the ones that do research on incurable diseases, and that's SARS and Ebola and other hemorrhagic fevers. So in order to do this research, you need the physical plants. So a lot of money went into building new laboratories, expanding the number of, I'll call them BSL-3 laboratories, and expanding the number of BSL-4 laboratories as well, so that if you go back to around 2000, I think there were about 4 level 4 laboratories in the United States. And I think if you look around now, you'll find easily double that number and then maybe a few more on top of it. So, so these laboratories have to be built in communities somewhere, don't they? And so the communities, and I'm speaking very much here about Boston, become upset because they don't know what's going on and they don't know how secure and safe that research is going to be. So up in Boston, there were 2 separate legal challenges to Boston University Medical Center as to the endangerment that the laboratory would pose to the community under the Environmental Protection Act. And this is all legitimate. If you build a facility in the middle of a city, for example, or anywhere, you have to answer to the Environmental Protection Act that asks you the question, are you posing a danger to the local community? And you must offer the worst case scenario. That is, it is your legal obligation for you to pose what the risks are, not to wait for somebody else to do it, but you as the entity that wants that lab, you must give us the scenario. You must talk about a possible release. And so Boston University did respond to the EPA requirement, but its presentation of the facts of risks was contested in court, and then was contested by a National Science Academy of Sciences committee, and then it went back and did it again, and then the same thing happened again. It was contested in the courts, contested by experts in the national science community. So the building up in Boston is built, and it's finished. It's a very large building to house level 3 and level 4 research laboratories, but it's empty. And it's empty. The equipment is there. The equipment, of course, is becoming outdated, and it sits there. And so you could say that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think if you're at Boston University Medical Center, you'd say it's awful, because they put some of their own money in. 125 million of their own money went into that building. The National Institutes for Allergies and Infectious Diseases put many millions into the building of that edifice and got nothing out of it. That's a bad thing. But on the other side, the local community feels that this has been a success. And when I say local community, I'm really talking here about people who rent homes in apartments in the lower class area of the South End where that facility now stands. So civil action is a very important part of the American response. Now let me go back here to Fort Detrick. Let me go back a bit to the FBI case, and also to science. I like this slide. I put it in my book because it shows where the Ames anthrax strain comes in 1981. It's a dead heifer over in Texas there, and it's died of something really dreadful, and the person who's taken account of this makes sure it gets to the U.S. Army, because the U.S. Army is doing defensive research. And if you're doing defensive research, here's a principle. You want the weapon, the anthrax spores in this case, you want the weapon to be very, very dangerous, because you're presuming that your enemy has a dangerous weapon, right? So you don't, there are less virulent forms of anthrax. There are forms of anthrax that are hardly virulent at all. But go for the strain that's really virulent, because that's what your enemy might have, and that's what you want to be protected against. Makes perfect sense in developing weapons. So anyway, I'm going to end right now with the question that Fort Detrick raises. This is an early publication. They have no conclusions, but they know the Ames strain is out of Detrick, and this should have been a red flag for the FBI about a pool of suspects, but the FBI didn't get to the pool of suspects for quite a long period of time. They know the Ames strain is there and that it's the main source, but they couldn't get to the pool of suspects. So anyway, along the way, I'll go by this quickly. This is, what does America do? You use anthrax to build your case for the Iraq War. Famous quote. And then here we are at the end of it, after years, 2005, 2006, as I describe in my book, the FBI has a match from from its repository, and the match is Detrick, the match is Usamrid, the match is actually a very particular flask, which is in the custody of Bruce Ivins, a very gifted and a very intelligent anthrax expert at Usamrid. Here's a picture of Bruce when he was a teenager, loved science, very invested in biology and biological sciences, came from a family of pharmacists, so that it was in the family. And a picture of him getting a medal from the U.S. government in 2003. So here's the build-up. We started with Fort Detrick. Here's the build-up. If you look at that chart above, the biotechnology campus of NCI, that's older, but the biodefense campus in the center is new and glittery and very expensive, and sits there as an amazing change, I think very much related to the anthrax letters. So here's NIAID funding. If you want to look at what happened with the funding issue, reemerging infectious diseases come in very strongly. So when you're hearing lately about H5N1 and you're wondering what were we doing with H5N1, it's out of biodefense, and if you go back to the root of it, it really is the anthrax letters. So here, I'll just end on this. What are we still learning about? Well, we're still learning about individual human susceptibility to anthrax. We're trying to implement biodefense project review. For example, with H5N1, was there a review process in place that would let the people who did the research on that avian flu understand what the repercussions might be in terms of danger or just in terms of media and public response? So where was the project review? We must work more on that. Standardizing biosafety and biosecurity. Well, look back at the Maureen Stevens case, the Florida case. Is the government going to be held liable? Is a commercial entity going to be held liable if bad select agents get out of their control? And I think the answer is yes, they're going to be held very legally liable. So try biosafety on that, try biosecurity, protect people as much as you can, and then look for institutional accountability. What you want to do is you want to have people safe at work, and then encourage adherence to the Biological Weapons Convention. Anyway, thank you so much. We're over time.
So we can
Yes.
take questions, and please repeat the question because it's not clear.
Yes, okay.
Anybody?
Stunned. Here's one. Well, the question is, I'll go just for the very end of it, like who sent the letters, but suppose it was an Al-Qaeda theft of the material and that it was really mailed out and that the FBI engaged in a cover-up. Well, I'm a person who was raised in a sort of rationalist enlightenment frame of mind. My first question is, where's the evidence? If you show me the evidence, I'm happy to look at the evidence, but I can't make conclusions if I don't have facts. And so when you get into conspiracy theories and you say the FBI did this or the FBI did that, I have to wait to see where those facts are because it's not a road I go down easily. It isn't the way I work. So it's the best answer I can give you. So that's interesting. The question is the nature of the targets. If you go for the media and then you go for two liberal senators who are, by the way, at that time debating the Patriot Bill, and I think some people would say that even Senator Leahy was obstructing the Patriot Bill. So if I understand the question would be, was it a right-wing source? And I think we can, again, we'll never know, but it is an interesting idea that, for example, to target the media gets you attention, but also maybe the person who sent the letters was thinking, well, what media would Al-Qaeda target? And I think the targeting of Tom Brokaw, by the way, was really brilliant because he was Mr. American hero. He had written the book on World War II. On 9/11, he was on site at 9/11 for hours and hours at a time. He was a really beloved figure, much more than his two competitors. So he was a really good target. I mean, if you were going to target the World Trade Center, Tom Brokaw would be the equivalent of targeting the World Trade Center if you went to the media. So I thought that was interesting. The Post had run very negative articles about Al-Qaeda, and the American Media Inc., the National Enquirer, even worse articles about it. So the media targeting, I think, made a lot of sense. If you go to Senators Daschle and Leahy, I think you're right. It makes it look like, that this is a bit of a right-wing thing. But again, we're into speculation on that. Yes.
The sarin attacks in Japan, a small group made that poison. Is it possible for just individual or small group to make anthrax poison? To make anthrax?
Well, this is what has always been brought up, is that you can do it in your garage kind of idea. Well, it depends on who you are. It depends on your skills. It's not like everybody could do it, but maybe some skilled people could do it. Sure, of course that's possible. But in the world of, countering terrorist threats, or in the world of keeping us all safe, the likelihood of that doesn't ring very high. We haven't had any more anthrax letters, you'll note. So if it was that easy, what happened? What happened is that nothing happened. I don't know anything about it. It's a question about was there somebody in Tennessee who was doing this? I don't know. That doesn't ring a bell with me. But the hoax letters, I can tell you, the hoax letters continue on now. And so when people want to vent their aggression, they don't necessarily have to use virulent anthrax, because people have learned to scare other people in different ways. So, but you're raising a very important question. It's about state level of investment in biological weapons versus what somebody could do in a garage. And my feeling is that whenever we see danger from anthrax or other biological weapons, select agents, there's usually a large entity involved. And that I take as more normal in history. Yes, question?
Do you have an idea where geographically would these new labs with BSL level 4 be distributed in the United States?
Well, there have been decisions made about where they should be nationally. The newest one is down in Galveston, which already has BSL, I think it has 36 BSL-3 labs already. So the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston is a major entity in select agent research. The Centers for Disease Control now has 2 level 4. Fort Detrick, of course, and the Fort Detrick campus will have 2 level 4s. The decisions are being made, like, to put these in very specific places, but I think people should know that there are 10 centers of excellence funded by NIH, which are nationally, regionally distributed, and that they become centers for select agent research within their regions. So you can go Northwest, you can go California, you can go mid, all around the United States. Just one more question back here, in the back. Yes.
Jen Schultz from Congressional Quarterly. I was just hoping you spoke a little bit about what the government has done spending-wise since the anthrax attacks to kind of respond, and there's all these different layers trying to improve biology, trying to get approval for vaccines, coordination, and being able to respond. And can you just, I don't know if you can speak to this, but where you think that more money needs to be spent or more attention, and how this is kind of played out?
Well, I would say it's not the money issue, although everybody wants the money and say they need the money. I think it's an organizational issue that you keep asking the question every time you read another news report: who's in charge? The H5N1 being the, I think, a very good example. Who's in charge? Who was watching the store? But the other thing is, should there be another similar event, who is going to be the spokesperson that Americans will listen to? And this is one thing that really concerns me a lot, because we were fairly centralized in our response when you look back on it. And well, maybe we didn't like how Washington handled the response, but basically Mayor Giuliani in New York was spectacular. He did a very good job of responding. Down in Florida, Jeb Bush stood up. He did his response. To whom is the nation listening? I think in Washington we had President Bush himself who was up there responding. But now everything is so Facebook, Twitter, internet. Where is the legitimate authority, the centralized legitimate authority that's going to inform people in the case of not just like an anthrax attack, but a really serious infectious disease outbreak? Where are we going to go to get that good information? Well, okay, you can go to the website of the CDC. What happened in 2001 is the website of the CDC broke down a number of times. It couldn't handle the traffic. So what's going to protect us against that? I don't know. But I think it's really important for us to think organizationally. Is the Surgeon General of the United States, right at this very moment, sufficiently educated about infectious disease, emerging infectious diseases, and biological weapons agents to respond, to tell the public what to do, in case of an outbreak? Where, again, to whom will we go when we need help?
Please join me to thank Jeanne again. And we have a book signing outside, so thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.